What's up, guys? This is Kaz with Elevate Your Craft, and welcome to episode number 10 of the podcast. And I got to say, this is a special episode for me because episode 10 seemed so far away at one point. And I'd like to thank everyone that participated in the podcast so far and got me to where I am, and I look forward to bringing you many more. I'd also like to thank my guest today, Iris Kolenski, for being on the podcast, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So today our main topic of focus will be yoga. And I'm sure we'll get into a bit of general fitness here and there. But, we'll talk about different things. We'll get to know Iris a little bit and what role yoga currently plays in her life and kind of how it all got started. We'll talk a bit about just beginners and people even considering yoga, some things they should take into account, any points or tips that Iris has. A bit on some institutions, so gyms, studios, and all that good stuff. So first off, why don't we just get to know Iris a little bit and the role that yoga currently plays in your life and where it all got started for you.
Yeah, sure. I've been heavily involved in yoga, I'd say, for about 4 to 5 years. But I attended my first yoga class maybe about 6 years ago. So I started pretty casually right out of university. In the past, I've been a dancer. I've been really into gymnastics, cheerleading. So fitness has been a big part of my life for as long as I lived.
It was a natural transition.
Yeah.
Kind of what you liked. That's cool.
Exactly. And I remember my mom always talking about yoga. She used to do it every now and then. And at the time, I had no idea. I didn't know anything about it, but I was kind of like, oh, it sounds like a good stretch.
Yeah. Oh, nice pun.
Yeah. And I started training just on my own at a gym near my parents' house when I moved back home after university, and I noticed that they had yoga classes. And so I attended my first yoga class in the gym there, and it was all right. You know, I actually didn't have that initial attraction to it. I was just kind of like, it's okay.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. And then, but I kept with it. I kept going. I think I was curious, and I knew there were different styles. So I tried a couple classes there, and I think a few months went by, and then I heard all the buzz about hot yoga.
Ah, yes.
So that's something that's become very, very popular.
That I've fallen prey to as well. Yeah,
in
I
North
understand.
America.
Yeah.
So I was like, I got to try this. This sounds awesome. So I tried hot yoga just in a local studio in Burlington. There's so many now. And that's what really kind of got me hooked. And I did a 30-day challenge. So you had to do yoga for 30 days. It was quite intense, and from there, I'd say I was really hooked.
So it was the hot yoga that, among other things, I'm sure, but the hot yoga that got you really hooked?
That's what I'd say what got me hooked, yeah. And even just because I was doing it for 30 consecutive days, I was introduced to a lot of different teachers and a lot of different styles.
Okay, yeah, so it gave you a good glimpse into what it has to offer.
Yeah.
And that kind of 30 consecutive days of yoga.
Yeah.
I can't even do twice a week at this point. That's amazing.
Yeah,
Wow.
I'm not sure if I'd strongly recommend it unless you have some restorative practices integrated in.
Yeah.
Like a hot yoga for 30 days. It's I wouldn't say it's ideal.
It's a good way to immerse yourself anyway. You mentioned a bit about styles, and this is something that I was pretty curious about even just now and when I started. The way I think of it is kind of like martial arts in that there's, taekwondo, karate, different styles. With yoga, there are different styles as well?
Yeah, and I get asked this question as an instructor all the time, and it's actually my least favorite question.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Glad I made it second in the list.
It's so
then.
difficult, just because it's so difficult to answer.
Yeah.
And because yoga has changed so much since it's been brought over to North America, since what it was traditionally in India years and years and years ago. So there's so many different traditions and lineages of yoga, and from there different styles branch out.
Okay.
And then you have the corporations that have made their own version of yoga. You'll hear
like
moksha,
Good Life and
power yoga.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Good Life might have a branded yoga. So it's really difficult to define and even list off all the different styles.
Yeah.
I'd say there's so many different traditions, and within that, there's a lot of different styles. You'll hear Ashtanga, flow, Hatha, Vinyasa.
Yeah, vinyasa. Okay, yeah.
And then there's all these new stuff, like a lot of the studios are offering bar, which has yoga integrated into it. There's yin, there's partner.
So bar is kind of like the ballet?
Yeah, ballet influenced
okay.
yoga. So I'd say it's, going in so many different directions, and there's so many different styles. And what I recommend for beginners is just to really get to know the instructors.
Okay.
And I always recommend a beginner class, a Hatha, something that's slower moving and focused on alignment and integration.
So what would you say among any studios or gyms that you've been to, like Hatha and Vinyasa, those are the most popular
Yep.
kind of designations?
Yep.
Okay. So what differentiates them?
Yeah.
Just in, characteristics, or would one be better for a beginner? You kind of touched on that there, or more advanced, what kind of...
Great question. Yeah. I would say Hatha is better suited for beginners for sure.
Okay.
But there's advanced practitioners that practice Hatha all the time. There's advanced Hatha yoga. But the main difference is a Hatha is a little more, it's slower moving and it's not flowing. A vinyasa is flowing and moving with the breath, so it tends to be faster paced.
Yeah.
Connecting breath to movement, so inhale, arms overhead, exhale, bow forward.
Okay.
So you're constantly moving, whereas Hatha, there's slower transitions. You're not really flowing. You may do a pose, hold it for several breaths, do another pose.
Okay.
And it also gives the instructor time to really talk through alignment, very detailed. Whereas vinyasa, you can still talk about alignment, but you don't have as much time when you're moving quickly through the poses.
Yeah, because they might use the traditional names of the poses as opposed to just kind of a more intuitive name or thing like that. And I know for me, being a beginner, the transitions are the toughest. There's absolutely no flow to what I do. It's anti-flow, and I kind of understand where you're going with that. That's kind of from a general standpoint. And one thing I thought of just on my own that came from a completely unrelated topic is I was actually just thinking of sales and my sales style and how that's developed over time. And I thought of the question, more on a micro level. So individual style. And that involves kind of with dedication to or immersion into the craft, whatever it may be, with confidence, with time, with practice. Would you say there is an individual style in yoga, where you can kind of look at someone and based on what they're doing, you kind of say, oh, that's Iris, that's her style. What are the habits or identifiers that you could maybe identify and pick out?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely individual style, but I would also say that individual style, if you stick with yoga, will constantly evolve. So it'll constantly change. But if I were to try to pick out someone's style, and if it was someone I didn't know, I would take into consideration, just basic personality points if I knew a few key things. For instance, if they're strongly type A personality.
Oh, okay.
Also, their level of mindfulness, awareness of their body, which is usually pretty easy to pick up on. If I give a few verbal cues and they don't quite get it, I'll know their awareness and mindfulness isn't quite at a deeper level.
Okay.
So they might be just more focused on placement, and that's part of their style and where they're at with their practice. And then personality, I think, really does come into play. There's, I think people that have very strong type A personalities, they're the ones that come to the 6:30 a.m. classes. They want the same class all the time. They want the hot, they want the flowing, they want the moving, they want to get in, they want to get out. And that's their thing, and that's okay. But
nothing kind of wrong with that. And you did mention personality, and ultimately, I think when it comes down to it, that's what style is. I mean, at least a big portion of it, because I think you develop the confidence to actually express yourself, no matter what it is, whether it's business setting, a sport, or even yoga. So I think that's great that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about that, but I don't know if that was just something I came up with, or but that's really cool. I kind of like that concept anyway. But one thing that I really wanted to do with this episode is give people, especially beginners and people that are even considering yoga, some insight into how they can do so, but also try and break down any barriers that they might have, or not even break down, but even just chip away at these barriers. And I think a good way to do that is identify some of those barriers and the challenges that they may face. And let me know if you think this is a good idea or not, but I really wanted to break it down kind of to the beginner. So someone who's actually started a practice, they're maybe 6 months and below in, and then also just someone who's thinking of joining yoga. So what are some of the challenges you see that someone who's just started training, whether, and we'll get a bit into male and female, because I think there are some unique fears or challenges that they face, but what would you say in general with someone just starting yoga, the challenges they may face?
I'd say one of the biggest barriers and one of the biggest challenges, and even maybe one of the biggest things that deters people from yoga, is they don't think they're flexible enough. I hear that all the time. They don't want to do yoga because they're not flexible enough. And actually, I had that thought before I became an instructor, because I went through my teacher's training after only a year of practicing. I'm right out of university, so I was really stiff, and I was like, I don't know if I can be an instructor because I'm not flexible enough. So I think it's a very common thought, but you do yoga so that you can lengthen your muscles. That's the purpose.
Yeah.
It's a journey. So you don't go into it already flexible. Most people don't. So one of the main goals, or I shouldn't say goal, but one of the main purposes and one of the main benefits of yoga is to lengthen your muscles, find extra space, and really open up. So I think it's just that mind shift that, this is something that's going to benefit me, my health, how I feel. You don't have to go in already, open.
Yeah, you're not going to be
flexible.
amazing at it if you haven't trained a day. And touching on the male-female dynamic, and me, of course, being a beginner male, I think the main challenge for me was, I guess, fear maybe, is that it seems to be a very female-dominated practice. And I know at the studio, I was kind of like, are there any other guys in the classes? And thinking back now, it was kind of silly, because now I'm like, who cares? I've been to many classes where I am the only guy, but that was definitely a concern. And starting with males, do you see any common fears or barriers that they may have when just starting their training?
Yeah, I'd say, and that's a common fear. A lot of guys are scared that they're going to be the only guy in the class. And I think I see more and more men in my classes as time goes on. But I do tend to see more older men. I'd say like 50 plus, opposed to younger men. And I think they're really looking for, at that point in their lives, to alleviate pain and alleviate stress. But a lot of younger guys, and this is a generalization, but are a little more competitive, a little more drawn to competitive sports, and they don't want to be they think yoga is maybe too slow moving or too laid back, and it's going to be just full of women and just not their cup of tea.
Might not build the muscle that they want, or that kind of thing.
I think it's all about balance. I don't think people should just do yoga. I think it should be integrated into their lives and into their fitness regime. But it's a very valid fear, and it's just another barrier you have to overcome. Step into the studio, give it a try. But the way yoga is even marketed in the media, Lululemon, it's targeted at women.
That's true. I never thought of that.
So I think it's natural that more women are drawn to it.
Yeah. Why else do you think that is? I mean, this is kind of touching on that the strength factor and Actually, I'll start with this, because this is something that I've come across just in my travels, you could say, and just training with different people. And the first I heard of it was actually in martial arts training. So there was a good mix of males and females, and I was just talking to a female classmate, and the idea of strength training came up, and we just started talking about it, and she was saying, I don't really like to do a lot of strength training because I'm afraid that I'll get too bulky, or I'll put too much muscle on. I'll start to look very manly. And at the time, I thought, I hadn't actually thought or heard of that before.
Oh, no.
And that dynamic, you, of course, being a female, I don't know if you can relate, or is this a common fear or barrier for women?
Oh, yeah, I can totally relate. You know, it's, and again, I think it comes down to exposure and what we're exposed to in everyday lives. You know, advertising, or the majority are very lean models that, women are constantly bombarded with those images. And, we don't want to be seen as, manly or masculine.
Yeah.
And then without enough knowledge on strength training, you might just jump to that
Of course,
assumption.
yeah.
But I think it's a very common perception that women think that if they're going to do a little bit of strength training, they're going to eat.
All of a sudden, yeah.
But
And of course, barring any substances or drugs or anything like that, I'm sure it would just accentuate your femininity, not reduce it.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, most women want to be toned. So, and if, you're practicing a lot of yoga, you want strong joints. So strength training is so, so important. So I think it's
Yeah.
important to talk about this and try to get that misconception out of the way.
Yeah. And we touched on, of course, men as beginners. What about women? Do you see anything that may be unique to them when they first started their training? Or is it kind of similar in terms
beginners?
of... Yeah, and so they've started training, and it's just some of the challenges, even if it's technical challenges or just mindset.
I'd say it's similar mindset. They don't have that fear of, being the only woman.
Yeah,
They know they're
yeah,
going to enter
yes.
a place that, there's a lot of females, but some women are self-conscious of their bodies.
Yeah.
So they don't, they're a little bit scared to come into a room where there's mirrors, for example, or same thing with the flexibility thing, or comparing yourself to others. So I think that those barriers are still there for women.
I kind of found it surprising when you said that was a common thing, was the flexibility. I'm not flexible enough, and that could just be because I've been active for a very long time. But the reason I actually started on yoga was to get more flexible. So I thought, wow, I didn't even realize that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, I thought it was kind of funny. But what would you say for people just kind of thinking about yoga? They haven't even gone to a studio. They don't really know what to look for. So going more now, I guess, to the institutions of, whether it's a gym or studio, I would think those are the only two. But what can people look for? What would you recommend in terms of, they're actually touring it or they're thinking about it? What are some things you might recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would recommend doing a little bit of research because the worst thing that could happen is, you go into a yoga class and you have a bad experience and then you may never want to go back again. So I think it is good to do a little bit of research behind the instructor, how long they've been teaching, whether or not they have a certificate, because it's not strictly regulated.
Oh, okay.
You are supposed to have a certificate, so many hours of training, but, depending on where the class is held, there's classes held at churches, there's classes held at youth centers.
Yeah, true.
Yoga can be,
rec centers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so you never know. So I do a little bit of research into just, to make sure the yoga instructor has that certificate, and at least a couple years experience is really advantageous. And then look for a place that has different styles of offerings, not just one form, because then you can have a little bit of exposure and some variety.
Yeah. And that's actually a good segue into hot and room temperature or cold yoga.
Yeah.
Some studios offer both. Some, I believe, offer only one or the other.
Yep.
Do you recommend training both? What are kind of the benefits of either one? Or would you say you'd be okay to kind of just stick to one?
Yeah, if I were to say to choose one, I'd say choose regular temperature. I don't think you need hot yoga. I don't, I do love it. I like teaching it and I like practicing hot, but if you do want to really advance in your practice, I think you need to have a regular room practice because when you're in the heat, there's other factors. You're sweating.
Oh, yeah.
There's, there's a bigger tendency to overstretch with the heat, which can be a concern and can lead to injury a little bit more than if you're in a regular temperature room. And then your heart rate gets going quite or a little bit faster than in a regular temperature room. So I would say if I were to pick one, I would choose regular temperature. I think both is great. I wouldn't recommend doing just hot.
Okay. So even for new practitioners to jump into hot might not be a great idea just for those. I guess it depends on the person.
Yeah,
That's
it totally
tough to say.
depends on the physical ability. If you're active, I think it's fine. If you're not a very active person and your level of fitness isn't too high, I wouldn't recommend jumping into the hot room.
Yeah. Wow. So I really should do room temperature because I normally stick to hot.
Well, I think
But-
it'd be a nice thing to try if you're looking to advance your practice. You
Yeah.
can get a little bit deeper
Okay.
into your practice,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, into the other elements of yoga. So,
Okay, okay. One thing I found quite fascinating about just general practice is that this, I don't know what to call it, whether it's like a spiritual side or more of a traditional side to it. And this thought came to me because I was having a conversation with a good friend, and he was a football player. So back in university, and during his practices, he had yoga sessions
oh,
sometimes.
that's great.
And he mentioned the names, the different names for the poses and things like that. And he was just kind of, because I'd mentioned that I'd started up again, and he was like, man, all the fancy names, all that kind of stuff, I wish they would just tell me to, lift my arm like that, to make it more, I guess, accessible.
Yeah.
And I thought that's an interesting point, because I'm sure not everyone connects to the more traditional side like some do.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about the separation of those two? Are they, can you separate them and just do kind of a normal, or I don't want to say normal, but it's just a non-traditional practice where it's purely physical? Or do you think it's beneficial to kind of implement both into your practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm okay with not integrating all the traditional elements. And personally, as an instructor, I don't really use the Sanskrit terms, which is the Indian language. And the reason I know a lot of them, but I don't feel authentic because I haven't studied it in enough depth. So I don't feel like I can pronounce all the words. And if I'm going to use those words, I would have rather studied a little more in depth the language.
Yeah.
So, and that's a personal choice. A lot of teachers will use those terms. In regards to it just being a purely physical practice, I would say it's no longer yoga, to be completely honest, if it's purely physical.
Okay, interesting.
You're doing the poses, but if you're not at all connecting to the mind, I wouldn't say it's yoga. If that awareness is not there and you're just kind of doing a pose here and there, then you're stretching.
You're going through the movements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The spiritual part, I think, comes later, but the mind-body connection is a huge element of yoga, and that awareness of the breath. And without that connection, I think it's difficult to call it yoga. And yoga, the term yoga in Sanskrit really means union of mind, body, spirit.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's throwing the gauntlet down.
Yeah.
No, that's a good way to think of it. And to be honest, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. And you get there. Everyone gets there if you stick with it. I think when you first start out, it is a physical practice. And I think that's okay. Whatever gets you there, whatever gets you on the mat. But then as you start to advance and you listen to the cues, you can't help but connect the mind to the body. And you're like, oh, I know how that feels now. I know what this should feel like in my body.
Yeah.
I know where, placement and alignment, of the different bones and muscles. And then
it is a huge challenge. And, when you said it kind of comes later, I can definitely attest to that, because for me, I'm just focused on surviving the actual pose. Just because I'm sweating, I'm there, and I'm like, oh my God, this hurts. So that mind-body connection, and I find that you do have moments, just even if they're very small.
Yeah.
But I guess that's how it.
That's how it starts,
right?
Yeah.
And then eventually you can you get into your flow, and that's something I wanted to get into as well. Is the idea of flow, because I think that's really cool, and I can't really do much of it right now, but I've been to classes where that has been, like you mentioned, the certain style. It's a big part of the practice. Where do you think it fits in to the overall, I guess, I don't want to say study of it, but practice of it, and how, what are the benefits of doing it? And would you say it's something that is really only intermediate or advanced level yoga?
Yeah, I would say even a beginner in yoga can do a flow as long as their physical fitness level is, allows them to do so that they can do it in a safe and effective manner. But the benefits to flow, I think it really allows you to connect deeper to your breath. So when you're moving through a flowing practice, you're really focused on connecting breath to movement. And the way the instructor will cue a class, you'll really hear inhale, do this, arms overhead, exhale, do that. So you're really, really linking breath to movement. And I also find it's a little more of a cardiovascular workout. So you have that
makes
component
sense.
when because you're constantly moving. So not only are you getting a stretch, you're getting a little bit of, your heart rate up. So those
Is it
benefits.
generally done in a sequence? So if you do, say, 5 poses, would you like flow a certain way? Like it seems to me that it evolves. So you'll start with something and then you slowly evolve to like a crescendo pose where it's like
totally. We call it pinnacle pose.
Okay, you know what, that's the word I was trying to think of, but crescendo came to mind.
It's so dependent on the tradition and the instructors. So some instructors teach every class and they have a pinnacle pose in mind, and they're working in that direction, slowly opening different areas of the body up so that when it comes to that pose, your muscles are ready, your body's ready. There's other traditions where you'll go into a class and they do the same sequence and the same series every time. So, and then there's classes where there's just chunks of the sequence that might be similar. So every instructor will sequence differently, and the length of the sequence can be, can vary by instructor and class as well.
Do you think that, I'm glad you mentioned that because this is something that I was curious about as well. Do you think that yoga could benefit from structure? So, and what I mean by that is, I think at this point, if you do, I find it might be valuable to go to the same classes at least somewhat consistently because of that. It's that instructor, they'll likely follow somewhat of a pattern. But in the idea of progression and structure where it's like, okay, this is exactly what we're going to do. This is the regression of the pose. This is the progression of the pose. Do you think yoga can benefit from that? Because I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you do go to a lot of different classes, it might be hard to consistently improve in certain areas. It kind of be scattered. Would you somewhat agree? Or?
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't really ever thought of it in that respect. And maybe it's the way I teach and, my personality. I like things that are constantly changing and I like new stuff. But I do think structure definitely helps beginners, and there's components of yoga sequences that are always the same, sun salutations, and familiarizing yourself with those sequences and through repetition I think is really helpful in advancing. I don't like putting a limitation on a studio. I'd hate to just have such rigid structure.
It's a balance, I'm sure, too, because the opposite.
But I think it's a great idea, maybe having a class at the studio, a beginner class, that it doesn't change much. You know what to expect, because I think there's people that are really drawn to that. There is a style of yoga, Bikram yoga, tends to go through the same routine every class. It's a hot style of yoga, and it's people really like it because it's the same thing each time, and they can advance and they can really progress in their practice and within that sequence.
Maybe those are the people that crave that kind of structure. Okay.
But no, I think it's a great question, and the poses in yoga, they don't really change. We have the same core poses, so you're always going to have that base. It's just that there's so many of them, right? But
so it's a wide base.
But you're always going to have downward dog, and that's a consistency. But I think it's a great thought, and I think certain practitioners could really benefit from more structure.
More structure, cool. Yeah. Now you've mentioned this I think several times throughout the podcast so far, and that's breath. And for some and me, sometimes it's hard to maintain that breath or really focus on it during, especially getting to the end or the shavasana where you're just you're beat, right? Where does breath fit in? How important do you think it is to practice? And just even from my experience, it really seems like that's what you learn very quickly, is that breath plays an enormous role in practice. So where does it fit in, and what are the benefits you feel of incorporating and being more aware of your breath?
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked up on that right away, because I think sometimes that's something that comes later, because beginners are so focused on placement and the pose, and you forget about the breath. But the way I describe it to most people is, think about what your body does when you hold your breath. You immediately tense up. Sometimes you might even initiate the stress response. And that's the opposite of what we want to do in yoga. right? So when you're trying to open and relax the muscles, you really want the breath to be constantly moving and flowing. And you're trying to tap into areas of your body where you might be holding tension. It could just strictly be physical tension, but it might also be emotional tension. And to dig deeper into those areas, you really got to use the breath to kind of, let go of any muscles that might be engaged that don't need to be engaged. So
is that what you, I know, because I do go to your class, of course, and I hear you say, breathe into this part of the body.
Yeah.
Which
sometimes doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, it feels very difficult to do so, because I'm thinking, I don't know, it's just really hard. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, because you're really only breathing into your lungs, right?
Of course,
And instructors say that, breathe into your back. But so when you breathe and you're expanding the lungs, a lot of us just focus on breathing into the front of our body, but also the backs of the ribs are expanding too. And it's almost just visualizing that area and relaxing the muscles. So it's more of letting go and really, focusing on that part of the body. You can't actually, you can't breathe into your legs. And, I might say that sometimes, but I'm like, tune into the muscles of your legs by using the breath. Is maybe a more detailed way of saying it.
Yeah.
But
That's quite enlightening. Yeah, because that's one thing I noticed. Because it was not a criticism. It's just, am I doing it right? Is that something I'm doing? I have no idea. So I'm glad I actually asked that, because it definitely helps.
Yeah.
Now, what sort of injuries are common? Because this is kind of the darker side.
From yoga or coming into yoga?
Coming into, from, again, with beginners or even people considering yoga, what would you say is something to consider where, I have a bad knee or a bad back? And further on that, how do you address that as an instructor?
So I'd say, people come in with every kind of injury possible, depending on what they've done throughout their life or what they're even doing right now, if they're in active sports or if they're a runner. I'd say to be really mindful of any injuries. And, I'm not a doctor, and, I think students really have to take their body, their practice into their own hands and really listen to their bodies. If I'm telling you to do something and it doesn't feel good in your body, it doesn't mean you should do it.
Yeah, because I think there is, and it's not necessarily brought on by the instructor or the surrounding classmates, but there almost is this pressure to make yourself do it, or at least try really hard to do it, which might not be a good idea.
Yeah, the ego always comes into play. There's, most of us have a competitive spirit, and as much as you want to stay on your mat and make it your own practice, and that's what we try to do in yoga, there's that tendency. It's tempting to look around and everyone's doing it, and my knee hurts, but I'm still going to do it so I can get into the pose. But I'd really caution against that, and that's not what yoga is about. It's all about our individual journeys, and I love seeing modifications. I love when I tell the class to do something, and I don't tell them to get the blocks, but there's that student in the back that gets out the blocks because they know they need it. That's inspiring to me. So I'd say work within your limitations. Always let the instructor know. I think that's really helpful, especially if it's a really serious injury, so that the instructor can kind of watch as much as they can. But it really is the student's responsibility to work with that and to listen to their body. I always say a little bit of discomfort is okay, but pain, you don't want to feel gripping pain in yoga at all. It's just, that's not what you're there to do. But, and then on the other side of that, you can injure yourself in yoga. It's not always known, but just like anything else, you can get injuries from yoga.
Go a little too far on that stretch, or fall or something. Right?
Yeah, it's usually overstretching. That's normally what it is. Hamstrings, back, hips, shoulders.
Yeah. Okay. And going further into kind of the instruction side of it, what would you say, being an instructor yourself, is key to actually teaching a class? I mean, are there any traditions or principles that you follow yourself, or ways that you kind of moderate a class that's in session that you kind of recommend to any prospective teachers or instructors?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really important to me to teach a class that's really focused on alignment, and that's kind of how I was trained in my background. we did a lot of anatomy. We went over alignment a lot. And I think that's really, really important. And I would recommend that for any teacher, because you are responsible for your class and your students to a certain degree. You don't want to put them in situations or in poses where there's a higher risk of injury. So I think you want to be very aware of who's in your class and their abilities, and you might not know up front, but just by doing a quick scan of the class and the first few poses, you can get an idea.
You feel out the room kind of thing.
And then teaching in a way that you can effectively communicate where you want the class to go. So it's not just placement. You know, placement is big, where you put your hands, where you put your feet, but alignment and the muscles and the bones is really big too. And what you're engaging and maybe what you're not engaging. So
alignment, it's better to sacrifice, say, the range of a stretch or a movement in order to maintain alignment.
I would say so. Yeah.
So that kind of slight curve in the back, you know, if you're doing whatever, a hamstring stretch or so things like that, where you kind of just want to maintain that over kind of pushing yourself to maybe mimic someone that's more advanced in the class, or even the instructor.
Exactly. Students get caught up in what they think the pose should look like.
Yeah.
And
that's so true.
It's going to look so different for everyone. And I, as another, a tip for teachers, I always try to, if I'm demonstrating, not go into my deepest point of the pose, or maybe I'll try to show it with modifications. I constantly try to remember to do that, because people tend to want to do what I'm doing. They're watching and they want to put themselves in that pose, and it may not be within their abilities. But I think you really have to listen to your body, and downward dog is a perfect example. You want to drive your heels to the floor. Everyone wants to drive their heels to the floor, but I'd say rather than driving the heels to the floor, it's more important to have a long spine and think about your back.
Which is definitely something I always do, just drive the heels to the floor, but now it's kind of bend the knees a bit and allow for
length in the back. And then, once you want to maintain the stability in the spine and the joints, once you got there, from there you can slowly ease the hamstrings into it. So
especially when you get a little more loose.
Yeah.
So what would the life of a yoga enthusiast or professional entail? Like, who do the teachers learn from, and what kinds of things do they do, whether it's retreats or some sort of communities that they participate in, or anything where they go to improve themselves? Like, what are some of the experiences or things that potential instructors could foresee if they take that path?
Yeah, you can get as deep and as involved in it as you'd like. There's, I think as you progress in your yoga practice, you begin to lead a more mindful life. And that's a journey for everyone. And, I think it touches every area and every aspect of your life, maybe even right down to your diet, what you're eating, things that you're buying, what you're doing, how you're traveling. But there's such a great yoga community in North America, and even outside of North America, there's so many yoga instructors now. But it's just, that much more knowledge and that much more people to connect to. There's most retreats, though, are targeted for teachers and students.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you don't have to be a teacher to go on a great yoga retreat and learn from the best instructors.
I see.
So there's retreats, there's even workshops. Every studio offers workshops that are a little more in-depth in maybe philosophy, maybe arm balances, an aspect of the physical practice of yoga. There's breath workshops, and even for those, you don't have to be an instructor, but they are great for instructors to further their knowledge. In Toronto, there's an annual yoga conference.
Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of instructors will go to that, do some courses with some very well-known instructors, network. But again, that's open to students as well. So I wouldn't say you have to be an instructor to really tap into that community.
The instructor side is more just a choice that you make.
Exactly.
Well, I guess essentially you're always a student.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Even if you are an instructor, you're still a student.
Definitely.
Yeah. So of the people you've spoken to or worked with, what are some of the common themes you hear them describe that has really made them committed to yoga? Is it just drastic changes in their lives, whether it was circumstances or health reasons, or they've just become passionate about the traditional side? Or are there any common connections among people who are very committed to it that you've heard?
Yeah, I would say lots of times personal challenges and, crises, whatever it is, grief, trauma. I think a lot of people will come to yoga after they've experienced something really difficult to really, get that stress relief and, that grounding, balance, and then even injuries. A lot of injuries bring people to yoga.
Yeah.
So
it's just more of a gentle, or it could be more of a gentle
rehabilitation.
Yeah.
So I'd say emotional and physical. Yeah,
because you can tell once people are, at least from the instructors and the students that I've encountered, they're in it. They love it, and it seems to, from the stories I've heard, it was just this switch where it went off and that was it.
Yeah.
From there.
Yeah. Has that happened for you yet?
Well, you know what? It's starting to. I've taken a real interest in it because, of course, calisthenics is my focus, and they complement each other so well. So that's why I've really taken an interest in it. But people that they kind of go through their daily lives, and they're not, hugely active, but they do want to stay healthy. How can people incorporate yoga, even in the smallest way, into their lives? Whether it's looking for, or if they're already part of a gym, just going to that one class, or even doing it at home or in the park.
Yeah.
Are there any ways that you maybe have done yourself, or that you can recommend that they can implement it in some way?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yoga doesn't have to be an hour long at a studio. You can do yoga anywhere. There's, to my colleagues, I often recommend little clips on YouTube. There's 5-minute stretches that they can do right at their desk just to open up. And, that's still yoga. So just familiarizing yourself with some poses that'll open up certain areas of the body where you tend to be tense, whether it's your upper back, your neck. If you're going for a run in the park, pausing after your run, doing a few stretches on the grass.
A downward dog or something like that. Yeah.
That's still yoga. Or, if you've had a really challenging week and you want to just, reconnect, just, finding a seated spot, focusing on your breath. If it's only 3 minutes, I'd still say that's yoga. You're in a seated posture, you're connecting with the breath, and you're just getting,
you're present.
Yeah, very present, some relief from stress. So, meditation's got, countless benefits. So you can integrate mindfulness, in that aspect of your life.
Yeah, I think that's huge for people that do it, even for me. Just that hour long after a hard day or something like that presence. And I think that's really, or a lot of what it comes down to is just getting all that garbage out of your mind for an hour. And I'm sure that extends after that. But just being more aware and self-aware, that really, really helps out. Are there any resources that you could recommend that people can learn more from, whether it's actual technical topics or websites or about studios, anything really that you use yourself maybe, or you can recommend? Yeah,
I really like Yoga Journal. It's a website, and I like it because it's basic, and you can click on a focus of the body. If you pick shoulders, then it'll show you visually all these stretches you can do.
Okay.
And they've got a lot of great articles, and they even have retreats listed on the website. And there's a magazine too, so you can even subscribe to it if you like the actual physical hard copies of the magazine. So that's an online resource. YouTube has a lot of great videos.
I was gonna say, there's gotta be.
You just have to, kind of make sure you're choosing. Look at the number of views. That's always a good indication.
That's a good indicator.
Yeah. Just so it's
they're credible. And that kind of thing. So.
But YouTube's great because it's I've done videos in my hotel room right off my computer. If you don't have time to go to class and you want to be, guided by an instructor. Even Instagram, I follow some yogis on Instagram that are really inspiring and show different poses and advertise different things. With social media, you have so much access to
everything, a lot of information,
everything. But I also recommend videos, DVDs, and Chapters carries a lot of the good brands. For beginners and even advanced. So it's everywhere now. It's easy to find.
To be. I mean, I'm sure kind of the 6 degrees type thing where you definitely know a yoga instructor. I know probably say 4 or 5 of them that eventually did become, and that's just kind of in my circle of friends, but that's great. I mean, it's certainly not a bad thing.
No.
But I think that's it. I mean, unless you have any other points you'd like to make or address anything at all.
No, I don't think I'd have anything else. I
Mhm.
just, I recommend yoga to everyone. So
Yeah,
if there's someone
yeah.
that's thinking, just try it out.
That's ultimately what I, of course, want to do is encourage it. I mean, it's something that I've kind of taken the plunge now, and a lot of the fears or insecurities I had before are completely gone. And I think kind of a good last thing to mention is I think a lot of it plays into the environment that the studio or gym creates.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no judgment in those types of things. And a lot of the time you just go and you don't really talk to anyone. You do your thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's very kind of personal, and then you leave.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think that's kind of what breeds a good experience. But
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, so that's it, guys. If you like the podcast, you can follow it at on Twitter at EYCKAS, same handle on Instagram, that's EYCKAS. There's also the Facebook page, Elevate Your Craft, all one word, as well as the website, www.elevateyourcraft.net. Thanks very much, and I'll talk to you again soon.